About 10 years or so ago, I was beginning a discussion with a class, an ethics class, on the subject of sex and sexual morality. And we began by reading a passage by Louis Vaughan, the philosopher. And the passage is this. He writes, "Unfortunately, people's positions on these questions, that is, questions about sexual morality, usually have more to do with their upbringing, religious tradition, or cultural background than with plausible moral arguments." The first question I ask the class is this, well, is this true? Is Vaughan actually capturing the situation accurately? Is what he's stating an accurate representation of the way things are? And if this is the case, why is this unfortunate? Why would it be unfortunate that our attitudes towards sexual morality would be based on what we experienced in our upbringings or through our religious traditions or cultural backgrounds? And how are these things in opposition to plausible moral arguments? Because you can see here that Vaughan is kind of setting these things up as mutually exclusive. You can have your upbringing, you can have a religious tradition, you can have your cultural background, and all of your attitudes about sex and sexuality can come from those things. Or they can come from plausible moral arguments. Well, what's a plausible moral argument? A plausible argument is one in which you have a conclusion that's offered that has reasons and rationale in support of it. You can look at a plausible argument is one that we look at and we say, yeah, I can see that this is a reasonable argument that should be entertained or could be actually advancing a true conclusion. And so the question here that struck me in this class meeting was, why is it that these things are being situated in opposition to one another? Couldn't it be the case that the attitudes and ideas that we developed through our experiences and our upbringing, our religious traditions, and our cultural backgrounds, couldn't those have also been based on plausible moral arguments? Do these things really have to be situated antagonistically? And so we talked about this kind of round and round and round this class, and the consensus of the class was that yes, it was the case that in previous generations, the people were much more superstitious. People were much more influenced by their isolated communities, their cultures, their religious traditions, their families. We didn't have social media. We didn't have all of this sophisticated communication and travel technology that we have now. And as a consequence, the attitudes and positions that people had in the past about sex and sexuality, those are no longer fitting for the world that we exist in today. And one of the things that students kept saying was, it's just sex. It's just. And we do a lot of things in our lives, and sex is just one of those many one things. There's nothing particularly special about it. And of course, I'm standing up there trying to keep my cool. I'm thinking like, what the hell is all this talk about just sex? And then I realized, it's like, dude, you're 147 years old. You grew up in a way different time than these folks did. And you're not going to be able to have this conversation with them and meet them where they're at if you don't actually understand where they're coming from and how they've developed the attitudes that they have. And so I realized, okay, you got to look into this and you've got to understand how our ethical ideas about sexuality and sexual morality have changed over time. And one of the first pieces that I stumbled on was the piece that you read for this week by Arthur Goldman called Plain Sex. And there's a passage really early on in this essay that I think captures a really important point in kind of a moment in time. And it's this passage here. It says, in the past, the ever-present possibility of children rendered the concepts of sex and sexual morality different from those required at present. And what really struck me about this passage is this word required. Because essentially what Goldman is saying is that there's nothing inherent about sex that would indicate anything moral. It's the circumstances surrounding sex and sexual activity that determines what our moral orientation towards sex and sexuality should be. And I think one of the things that is important about this, it struck me at the time of reading it, is that Goldman wrote this piece in 1977. It's still widely published today in current anthologies. And what's interesting about that to me is it sort of marks this fulcrum point or this tipping point in our culture's attitudes towards sex and sexuality, where you had us coming out of the 40s and the 50s and the 60s, for all of human history beforehand, when contraception wasn't widely available, and sexual activity carried with it significant risks of pregnancy. And that brought along with it all kinds of cultural risks then, and economic risks that were associated with unwed pregnancy, single motherhood, unwanted pregnancies, and so on and so forth. And Then, of course, we hit the 60s, and in particular, the development of the birth control pill and its ability to give people, particularly women, of course, tremendous control over their reproduction. And they were essentially gained the ability to separate the risk of pregnancy from sex. And they were able to sort of cleave those things apart to a large degree. And then, of course, it's no coincidence that you see then in the 1960s the sort of birth of the free love movement, and then the explosion of the pornography industry in the 1970s. And we just kind of started moving away from seeing sex as anything particularly special. And that made it really difficult for us to talk about sex and sexual morality, or sex in terms of morality. There was this brief moment in the 1980s when AIDS arrived on the scene and just started wiping out populations of people. There was this brief moment where as a culture we raised this issue about sexual morality. But it got raised in a really kind of funny way because, or not funny, but an unfortunate way, because the conversation was focused on whether or not same-sex sex was somehow unique and therefore deserving of particular moral condemnation. But there was never any conversation about sex and sexual morality in general. We had moved so far away from thinking about sex in terms of moral terms that we just couldn't figure out a way to wrap the idea of sexual morality into all kinds of sexual activity to see if there were any viable or plausible arguments we could be making. But sex was something different from just the day-to-day ordinary things that we do. All right, so that's the question on the table for us with this thought primer. Is sex just one of those things that we do among the many things that we do with other people? We text people, we go to parties, we play games. There's nothing about any of those things that seems to be inherently in to be in its own moral category. Well, is that what sex is? Is sex just one of these many things that we do? Or is sex morally different somehow? Is there something about it that's inherently ethical?